Welcome to Business Talk, presented in collaboration with the University of Rio Grande and the Ohio State University South Centers, from the heart of southeastern Ohio at the University of Rio Grande TV studio. Our goals are simple: promote the University of Rio Grande and the Ohio State University South Centers, as well as advocate local small business and their support organizations. More importantly, promote southeastern Ohio as a wonderful place to live, explore, and learn. There are many different ways you can find us. The University of Rio Grande Cable Access Channel 17, live online at blogtalkradio.com, and on YouTube if you are unable to catch our show live. Introducing our co-hosts, Jason Winters, Mike Thompson, Patrick Dengel. Thank you for tuning in. We hope you enjoy the show.
I work with fruit and vegetable growers, gardeners, home horticulture throughout Ohio. I'll be in Illinois here in a week to speak at their fruit and vegetable conference. I was in Kentucky earlier this month. We do a lot of research, field research on commercial fruit and vegetable production. They're at the South Centers at Piketon, and that's how we just spread the word on our research results, because we do the research and we take those results out to the other states, other countries, other counties, for farmers can adopt the techniques that we've researched.
So what's the weather like in Senegal?
When I was there in August, it was 120 degrees out in the desert region. But I'd take 120 degrees of that rather than 90 degrees here in southern Ohio, because there's no humidity. It's almost like Arizona or California. So that's why we are working with those farmers, that they can have great sandy soils, lots of sunshine, lots of warm temperatures, and we're hoping we can get them to produce fruits and vegetables on that land.
But that has to be a lot of different growing techniques.
Oh, yeah, it is. Somewhat different. There's lots of labor. That's a good thing. There's a lot of labor over in Senegal. But we're trying to teach them how to use irrigation, because in those desert regions, the only way you can grow any crops is with irrigation. So part of our project over the last 5 years was to divert a freshwater river that's been flowing out into the ocean for centuries, and we diverted that 30 miles inland out to these villages in this sub-Sahara region of San Luis, and so they're able to now irrigate crops. We're teaching them drip irrigation. They got water to the villages. It's sort of different, but it's the same type of things that we do here in the United States. We just have to adapt for their cultures and their temperatures and their climates.
So the soil is very sandy?
Very sand, yeah, just like Florida and Arizona and California. So going to be some good production there. But today we may talk about that some other time, but what I'm here today to talk about is community gardens. That's a big popular thing here in Ohio, in the Scioto County area, here in Gallia County, throughout the state. There's been a big resurgence in people putting in community gardens, and we're going to be having a workshop down at Portsmouth next Tuesday. Pat and I are going to be putting that on maybe for those folks that are looking at starting a community garden, because there's some things you need to think about. You just don't go get out the rototillers and start tearing up ground. You gotta, especially if you look at communities and you're maybe using some public lands, or if there's a neighborhood involved, you got to.
What exactly do you mean by a community garden?
Oh, a community garden is where maybe you get like a group of folks. Could be as small as I got one neighborhood inside of county that there's 5 neighbors all together. There was a big empty plot of land there, and they all work together on caring for and tending to that plot of land to grow fruits, vegetables, flowers. Could be tree fruit, could be small fruit, just anything to make that idle land produce and bear fruits and vegetables for that community, that neighborhood, or that group. Other community gardens could be city lots. I have one project in Dayton that I'm working with a couple other ag educators, Suzanne from Montgomery County and Tony from Clinton County. We've been working with them for 3 years, where they have almost 2,000 acres of vacant lots. If you go to these cities, you see where they're knocking down these old houses and these dilapidated buildings and these factories that have went out of business, and they're just knocking them down. You have a big vacant lot there. In Dayton, there's 2,000 acres of vacant lots, so part of this project that we just received some funding from the city of Dayton to develop these lots into food production units. So you can actually, a community garden could advance to an urban agriculture type of business enterprise where you can actually be generating produce that you in turn will sell and turn that into cash for whoever's involved.
Some of us are have a green thumb. Some of us are able to plant and actually see things grow. Does it really take a lot of ability to grow in a community garden?
What it does, it takes a lot of management, and depending, Jason, like we talked about, the makeup of your particular community garden, it comes down to people. You know, those 5 neighbors need to have it lined up well in advance. Who's going to be taking care of what? Who's going to be turning on the irrigation? Who's going to be pulling the weeds? Who's going to get the produce? Many times with the community garden projects that I've been involved with, you see where everybody has their hands up, they're going to do it, and you get 1 or 2 folks that actually go out on their hands and knees, planting, weeding, caring for, and then everybody shows back up again at harvest time to eat those delicious tomatoes and those sweet corn and peppers and melons. So that's part of the planning process, and that's what we're going to cover next week in the workshop is, you know, before you get involved with a group, whether it's a neighborhood or a community, make sure everybody is in agreement who's going to do what, because never fails. When the work needs to be done, everybody's busy when it's, 80 degrees and 80% humidity outside. But then when the tomatoes are ripe and the melons are ripe, everybody wants to come be a part of it.
I've seen a lot of large family gardens, where the whole family gets together on Grandpa's lot or something, and they always plant, and everyone gets excited in about May.
Yeah.
They get out there and they work the ground up and they kick their shoes off, and they have a wonderful time planting.
Yeah.
And then they start seeing it come up, and it's growing, and everything's going great.
Yeah.
But then there's weeds come up.
Memorial Day gets pretty hot, when it's 90 degrees, you don't want to be out pulling those weeds. You forget the hoe, you forget the rototill. Yeah, that's part of the planning process with a community garden. You have to have all that set in advance with all the players, whoever's going to be involved, no matter what that garden's going to look like. It can take many different shapes and forms, but all of this needs to be worked out. Really, on a community garden, the stuff that's usually the hard stuff, the weeding, the planting, the seeding, the harvesting, is actually the easy part of a community garden. It's the management and how everybody's going to get along, the social aspects of a community garden that usually ends up getting our folks into more problems than the actual work itself.
So the old adage, good fences make good neighbors. I'm going to guess some good planning with community gardens is going to make good neighbors.
That's
in
a
this
good place to start, and that's where we'll be emphasizing a lot of the planning aspects of a community garden. And that planning needs to take place now. That's another thing. Everybody gets excited in April and May, but really to do a good planning and to put together a good community garden really probably should have started last fall, because a lot of these vacant lots may have been grown up in a lot of perennial weeds. They haven't been farmed or gardened for years, if gardened at all. So you need to have a soil test taken to see what that garden's going to need in terms of maybe increasing the pH, increasing the fertility levels. And then in some of these cities, that's what we experienced in Dayton. We had a good, really beautiful school lot that was ready to go. The city gave us the okay. We were nice big athletic fields that we're part of, and I got all excited. Oh, this is going to be some good big fields out in downtown Dayton. Well, right next to it was an old paint plant, and that paint plant's been there for 50, 60 years. Once we pulled some soil samples, we found out there was all kinds of contaminants in there. So even though it's nice, beautiful, green growing grass and everything for a food production area, it's not the best location. So we haven't ruled out that location, but we're not going to be able to use the soil. We will have to use some other techniques like bring in soil, make raised beds, pot culture, growing in troughs. We'll have to do something else. We won't be able to plant like we traditionally do inside into that soil just because of contaminants. So that'd be another thing in that planning. Don't think you can just start breaking ground right away, because that testing takes some time, and you don't want to be planting in an area that has some contaminants that could impact that food crop.
Well, Brad, while you were talking there, just the last minute or so, what you were saying, I was not hearing. I kept hearing dollar signs.
Okay.
You're talking about testing and bringing in soil and all of this. I'm going to go out on a limb here and say that maybe some of these community gardens are going to be rather expensive for people to be a part of.
Really, we've done the research at the OSU South Centers and of a lot of these techniques, bringing in raised beds, bringing in different pot cultures, sock systems where you take it's a product socks. Yes,
your old socks.
A little bit bigger than my socks, Patrick, but it's a material like you see along when they do construction sites along the highway. They use the black filtration. Pieces of filtration socks that help reduce soil erosion and slows down the water. That is now being used in the gardening and commercial agriculture business. So you would fill those with compost and then just bring the socks in. And they're actually pretty cheap. You have an initial investment, but you can get 10 to 15 years out of them. So yeah, it may sound expensive. The soil testing, we can do that at the county office for about $15. So no, we're not. There's a lot of stuff that needs to be done, but it's really not that expensive. But that is a thing that would have to be brought up in the planning stages of community garden. Is that neighborhood or those community of folks need to figure out who's going to pay for those costs: the soil testing, the irrigation, the compost socks. So there will be some investment, but not any more than you would with a traditional garden.
A quick question: suppose I want to grow corn, and Jason wants to grow carrots, and perhaps Brad, you want to grow celery.
Mm-hmm.
How do we get our plot? How do we arrange it so that my corn doesn't infiltrate onto your celery or your carrots?
Well, that can happen, but in a community garden situation, really, you can have individual plots where you would be in charge of growing your own celery, your own carrots, and it's actually staked out. You get so many square feet of property. In a real community garden where everybody's working together, maybe, Pat, you're a good sweet corn grower, so you'll grow the sweet corn, and Jason's a good celery grower, so he'll do the celery, and then I'm a good tomato grower, so I'll grow the tomatoes, and then we all pull that produce and that harvest together, and then divvy amongst all the people that are involved in that community garden. So there's different ways you can do it. Have your own individual plot where nobody touches it. That's your, if it grows up in weeds, that's your responsibility, but a true community garden where everybody is involved would have everybody do their specialization, their specialty in terms of production.
It's interesting you mentioned celery, Pat. You know, I don't know that I have ever seen anyone grow celery. Can you grow celery in this area?
We can grow celery. Actually, in Ohio, there is a town up in northwest Ohio, up in the muck crops area, where it's a high organic content soil called Celeryville. However, they still grow some celery, but it's not the celery that was being grown up there 60 years ago, because there have been, in that organic soil, because it's farmed vegetables after vegetables after vegetables, there's been some soil-borne disease organisms that have accelerated so high that even, one, they can't keep it out of vegetables because it's very expensive ground, but two, these disease levels have accelerated so high that they can no longer grow a lot of celery up there. So Celeryville isn't what it used to be 60 years ago, but there is still a little celery. But yeah, you can grow celery. It's you would transplant it because it's a very long crop, and it really doesn't like a really high heat, so you'd have to transplant that fairly early or as a fall crop. And this protected agriculture using the high tunnels or some mini tunnels out in the garden can help extend that season.
So it'd be good to put out with your cabbage and
yes,
your
yep, same type
broccoli,
same type of crop. Yeah, it's a cool season crop, so we can put that out early, or it can tolerate a small frost late in the fall.
I think I need to plant some of that,
Yeah.
Patrick, for you. Yeah, so you can put your peanut butter on it.
Well, that's another thing we're thinking about growing. We're gonna
Peanut butter?
peanuts to make the
Peanuts.
peanut butter. Yeah, we have a few farmers and gardeners that have been playing around with peanut production, but working with some of the folks at some of the southern universities, like down in Mississippi and in the Carolinas, I've been talking to them, and we do have some heat units in southern Ohio here, enough heat units that we think we can produce our own Ohio-grown peanuts. So stay tuned on that one. That's going to be some possible upcoming research.
Can it be done recreationally? I mean, is
Yeah,
there enough high heat, August?
Yeah, you can do it. We'd plant them. They don't tolerate a frost. You'd plant them
Right.
after your frost or protect them. But get them planted as early. We need about 120 days, 140 days, depending on some varieties. So, yeah, go ahead and throw some in in your garden there.
Well,
and
I saw
you'd
one of
be
my
surprised.
agriculture books. It had peanut plants in it. And I thought, well, you can't do that up
Yep,
here.
we sure can,
Well,
especially
we may
here
have
in
to try
southern
that.
Ohio.
We may have to try that. I like my peanuts.
Yeah, but these community gardens, I've always been one ever since I studied horticulture at Ohio State, where any piece of ground that can be farmed or can be a food producer, we're going to have about 40, quite a few billion people more, 2.5 billion people or so to feed over the next 40 years. And I think we're going to almost have to be growing on any piece of ground that we can to produce enough food for everybody. So that's where if we can take advantage of these community lots, the city of Dayton estimates they spend over almost $2 million a year just mowing these vacant lots. Well, if it's growing grass and growing weeds, with a little bit of management, a little bit of tender loving care, I'm sure we can grow produce and food crops on those same vacant lots.
Well, let's talk about that just a little bit. Someone in the city, they've got a vacant lot next to them that's always ignored.
Mhm.
Where does someone start? Where do they begin? Do they go to the city and ask, or do they?
Yeah,
where's the starting point?
if they're interested, anybody interested in starting a community garden, first stop would be I'd like to come to a person like me or their county ag educator who can line up everything we've just talked about, all the management and the organization and the social aspects of community garden, what they're actually going to get themselves into, but then to look at the actual property, we would want to determine who that landowner is.
Right, you don't want to go digging up someone
No,
else's
you don't
property.
want to. Not a good idea to start putting all that time and money into growing produce on somebody's ground you don't know whose it is. So first we'd have to make sure they know what they're getting into before they even think about, or the minute they think about wanting a community garden. But then they would need to see who owns that land, get permission. If it is a city or a township or a county property, there'd probably have to an MOU, a memorandum of understanding, would have to be developed between that gardening group, or even sometimes Extension has sponsored a community garden. We don't sponsor any in Scioto County, but I don't, in other parts of the state they have. So Extension could actually, and now that takes a lot of work because that MOU has to be gone through the university, but just a memorandum of understanding, for that doesn't grow up into a weed patch, and if there is a problem. There are other things we need to keep in mind too. Once we identify whose land that is, then get the memorandum of understanding. Then we have to look at the food safety aspects. There's a lot of things that us farmers are having to do to abide by a lot of food safety rules and regulations. Not spreading manure on the field prior to 6 months prior to a harvest. That's just a simple thing. We have one community garden in Portsmouth right down by the river, and it's in a floodplain. So what if we would get that community garden planted, or we ready to plant those tomatoes or even harvest those tomatoes, and we get a flood? The water comes up and actually gets into that community garden in June, July when we're harvesting. Probably not a wise idea to go ahead and harvest your cabbage or your tomatoes or your beans if they've had the floodwaters come up out of the river. So there's a lot of food safety issues we need to think about.
Why not? For our listeners that don't understand what's in that water.
Oh, I don't know what's in that water, but there could be a lot of stuff in that water that just isn't good for human consumption. And if that cabbage or that head of cabbage or that broccoli would get them floodwaters on it, the contamination potential is very high, especially with a body of water like the Ohio River coming up and getting into our garden and our community garden. So we would have to make sure everybody understands that we probably would, if we had a major flood like that in an area like that, we'd probably want to maybe even destroy that community garden just from a health aspect for people don't get sick from the consumption of that produce. But when you think about that, like I mentioned, the contaminated soils there in Dayton, we want to make sure that there's no contamination in those soils before we go ahead and plant those crops. And
I think our engineer
something
behind the
happened
scenes
here.
is running sound effects.
But the food safety aspects, and there's a lot of proper post-harvest handling procedures that we if we've always bought our produce, we may not know you must wash that produce prior to consumption, not just eat it right out of the field. So we do GAPS training, good agricultural practices training, our food safety training, and a lot of community gardens also have a food safety training course, which we're also going to be having in Scioto County, food safety training as well as a canning course as well. So if anybody's interested in the Scioto County area, or a lot of other counties put on these same trainings, I would highly encourage anybody looking at community gardens to get involved in those as well.
So some of my family members actually take a salt shaker with them out to the garden. That's not a good idea.
Probably not a good idea, but if it's a family garden, there's no contaminants, you haven't applied any manures to that field 6 months previous to harvest. We do have some techniques, plasticulture techniques are what they call it, where we would actually make our raised beds, cover that raised bed with a sheet of black plastic. The black plastic does many things. It helps warm the soil up, it absorbs the sun's energy, warms up that bed, that plant gets off to a better start. Plus, the most important thing from a food safety aspect is all your produce is laying on that plastic-covered bed and doesn't have the soil splashing on it, nice, cleaner produce. So there are techniques that are being used in community gardens to help just be able to take that salt shaker out and eat that cucumber or that tomato right out of the patch.
By the way, Brad, last time that you were on our show, you were talking about the raised beds and the plastic, and I went out, I bought me some of that.
Good.
And we had excellent results.
Did it work out
last
good?
year.
Great.
We put our cabbage in, our broccoli in, our cauliflower in, we put them in all early and planted them through that plastic.
Did it work great?
Plant. Oh, my
Kept
goodness.
the weeds down?
Oh, it was fantastic.
Good,
Had a
good.
wonderful, wonderful harvest.
Yeah, but those are the types of techniques we have to use, that we encourage use. And we've researched them. We can take farmers and gardeners right out to the fields and show them how it's being done and teach them how to do it. But it's really not that difficult, is it?
No.
Now that you've adopted that technology.
It takes some time.
It takes some time, but in the long run, you probably spend less time managing that from a weed management standpoint. Plus, that produce was clean, wasn't it, coming off of that plasticulture bed?
Yeah,
so,
very nice.
Quick question for someone that is not into the farming end, not even into the gardening. What are the easiest kinds of crops that you can grow that you can be pleased with at the end of the growing season?
Well, Pat, all of our fruit and vegetable crops rely on a lot of management, that tender loving care. I don't really think there's any that are easier or very easy to grow. There are some that are easier.
I don't know any that you can throw seed in the ground and come back in 3 months and get fruit.
Without doing anything to it. And I think that's where you're getting at, Pat, is easy to you.
I think easy for you means going to the grocery store.
Even throwing the seed may be a hard task for Pat. But, sweet corn, you mentioned sweet corn earlier. Sweet corn is one of our easiest crops. You can plant that crop. Really don't have to do much to it. You make sure it has the fertility it needs, control the weeds through tilling or hand hoeing. 60 to 80 days later, you have your sweet corn. But you brought up a good point earlier about your neighbors. In a community garden setup, say you have your white sweet corn that you have in your garden plot, and Jason happened to have in his plot right next to yours a planting of ornamental Indian corn, the colored corns that we use for decoration. One of you two are probably going to get mad because your white sweet corn pack can cross-pollinate with Jason's ornamental Indian corn, and you can end up having purple kernels and pink kernels in your white sweet corn, and you, Jason, could, in your ornamental corn, have some white silver queen kernels mixed in with your Indian corn, which would reduce your quality. So you do need to keep that in mind in a community garden situation. Not too many other cross-pollinations occur. Some people think that somebody's cucumbers cross-pollinate with their melons, and the melons taste like cucumbers. Well, that doesn't work on those types of crops until you would replant those seeds. If you get a cross-pollination in that first generation, it won't ever show up on the fruit till they took those seeds, plant them next year. Then you get some quirky-looking melon or some quirky-looking cucumber. But on sweet corn, you will see that first year in that ear. So yeah, if you're going to plant sweet corn in your plot, Patrick, keep it far away from Jason's ornamental corn.
Well, you did bring up a good point about pollination, and we know that beehives are very, very important. So if you're doing this in the city, is there enough pollinators that will allow the crops to be pollinated?
Yeah, believe it or not, you wouldn't think there are, but we did some studies, me and Dr. Mary Gardner, who's an entomologist at Ohio State. We had surveys we were doing down in southern Ohio, but a majority of her was done in the city of Cleveland. And there are many pollinators. May not be just the honeybee, but there's leaf cutter bees, there's bumblebees, there's all different types of pollinators within those cities. So yes, there are enough pollinators in these city community gardens. However, we need to teach those community gardens to manage their plots, just like we teach our farmers. You don't want to I get the jitters when I go into a community garden. I see where somebody has smothered their cucumbers with 7-Dust. 7-Dust is a carbaryl type of a chemical, and I don't encourage the use of 7-Dust because it will control the cucumber beetles in your cucumbers. However, the honeybees pollinate those cucumbers, and if they land on that cucumber plant that has that white 7-Dust on and get some of that in their pollen baskets or on their feet and take it back to the hive, then you can get a lot of honeybee kill and die off just by that one little bit of carbaryl or 7-Dust taken back to the beehive by that bee. So when we do the community garden, we also want to educate those that are the gardeners to not use those types of chemicals and protect those pollinators, because they're getting scarce. And this winter we're having now, -11 yesterday and -7 we had a couple weeks ago. That's not, the reports are the honeybees aren't taking it too well. They may have plenty of honey in the hive, but they can't move. Once they consume the honey in that region where they're all balled up, they can't move when it's that cold, and so they're actually starving with honey just 2 inches away from them. They just can't, it's too cold for them to move. So
that's interesting.
we need to watch out for those pollinators. Thanks for bringing that up, Pat.
We have 2 minutes left, and I know we have a whole bunch of questions to ask. Are there some things that you would like to bring about that we weren't able to talk about?
Well, yes, there were, and that's why if you're interested, you can come to our community garden workshop next Tuesday, February 4th. Pat and I are going to be hosting that, and we are going to be videotaping that as well as YouTubing it for later viewing. So if you can't make it next Tuesday down at the Scioto County Welcome Center, there will be opportunities to watch that at a later date on one of our YouTube channels as well as our website. So that's next Tuesday, February 4th, 1 to 4 at the Scioto County Welcome Center. Address is 342 2nd Street there in Portsmouth, and it's actually Pat's office as well when he's down there helping the Scioto County Chamber of Commerce.
Now, do they need to RSVP? Or
it'd be nice if they want to give us a call there at the extension office. It's 740-354-7879, and probably Lacey will answer the phone. But we'd like to just have a rough idea, because we will have some handouts, and it's always easier if we have a rough idea how many are coming in to have enough handouts for everybody. But what did you say that your office used to be called? It was an old department store or something, or what did you?
Kendrick's.
Kendrick's, okay.
Kendrick's used to have their store down there, and then they were kind enough to leave that to the Portsmouth Chamber of Commerce in the city for all the different promotions that they do.
So that's where we're going to be having it, at the
Yes.
old Kendrick store, which is right in front of the mural. So if anybody knows where
That's
the mural wall is, that's where it's going to be. So yeah, we didn't cover everything we needed to, Pat, but any information they'd like to get, come to the clinic next Tuesday there in Portsmouth, or stay tuned. Look at our website, southcenters.osu.edu. You can go to Horticulture, and you can find all of our past programs as well as our webinars on there.
Brad, want to thank you.
Yep, happy farming.
Yes.
And
Thanks for having me.
we will be talking with you very soon, and hope to have you on the show.
Thank you.
I'm Patrick,
I'm Jason.
And I'm Brad.
and for Mike, we bid you a good evening.